Hello, I'm Mike Bird, lecturer in New Testament at Ridley College, and welcome to the Nazareth to Nicaea podcast and vodcast, the program where I'm going to talk about everything pertaining to Jesus in the early church. We're going to look at the historical Jesus, the Christ of faith, the Jesus of the New Testament, the Jesus of the Gnostic Gospels and other Christianities. We're going to look at the debates, the doubts, and the dissenting positions. Now, the way this is going to work is that the episodes will be recorded. Initially, they'll go onto my Substack page, but later they'll also come up on my YouTube channel, which is called Advancing in the Christian Tradition, and also in a usual format where you find all the regular podcasts and shows. Today, I thought we would kick off the premiere episode, the first episode, looking at a doozy of a topic, a controversial one. Did Jesus exist? Or looking at that old boogeyman of Jesus mythicism. Let me kick off with a quote from a fairly well-known New Testament scholar who said this: "Of course, the doubt as to whether Jesus really existed is unfounded and not worth refutation. No sane person can doubt that Jesus stands as founder behind the historical movement, whose first distinct stage is represented by the oldest Palestinian community. But how far that community preserved an objectively true picture of him and his message is another question." Now, that is a quote, of course, from Rudolf Bultmann, his book, Jesus and the Word. For Bultmann, he accepted as historical fact there was a Jesus and he was indeed crucified. But after that, for Bultmann, all bets were off. I mean, he reckoned we could know pretty much nothing about Jesus's intentions, his aims, his self-consciousness. Maybe through the Gospels and through perhaps Paul, we can find echoes of his teaching about the kingdom, but the man himself is inaccessible to us. You can get a few echoes of the message, but that doesn't matter, because as long as Jesus was crucified as a historical event, that is the only historical thread you need. But after that, I think for Bultmann, the rest of the story could be pretty much set in Narnia for all it matters. But he still needed a historical Jesus to be crucified. Now, I've had various interactions with the Jesus mythicism crowd, and I've had different thoughts about it over the years. I did have the pleasure of being involved in a documentary called Marketing the Messiah, very ably produced by Cameron O'Reilly, and that was it wasn't explicitly Jesus mythicist project, although it was funded by a lot of Jesus mythicist people, and it does have a bit of a 5-minute cameo at the end, giving a few questions to the whole Jesus mythicism project. But it was a fairly good documentary. Had people like David Runier, Mark Goodacre was in it too, even myself, and it raised those sort of questions. But when we went to the opening of it, which they had in Melbourne, they had like a grand opening. I was there. Also, some other New Testament scholars I know were there. Sean Winter, I think Robin Whitaker was there too. And I'll never forget, they had a Q&A at the end, and there was this lady from overseas, and we were discussing things in a Q&A, and she just sort of randomly starts saying, "The Argentinian Pope is evil, is evil, is evil. He has blood on his hands." It sounded cartoonish. I mean, she could do the voiceover for a Disney movie. It was amazing. And I thought, wow, this is weird. So I thought I need a bathroom break. And I went to the bathroom, and then there was a guy in the bathroom, in the sort of urinal beside me, as us men do. And he turns to me and he says, "Oh, this Jesus mythicism stuff, it's such a load of nonsense." And I thought, yeah, I know. Tell me about it. And he goes, "It's so clear Jesus was actually, Simon Bar Kokhba. They're the same person. I mean, people have just got the chronology 100 years messed up." And at that point, I'm going, "Oh, really? I need to finish my business very quickly and get out of here." So it was a an interesting documentary to be part of, but the crowd of people who were there attending it, it was not my usual. It was not my usual group of friends and interlocutors that I hang around. But yeah, Marketing the Messiah, not an explicitly Jesus mythicist film, but definitely attracted a lot of people who were funding it and interested in it. The other thing I think about when I think of Jesus mythicism, the view that Jesus did not exist, was a editorial board meeting of the Journal for the Study of the Historical Jesus. I was on the editorial board up to fairly recently when I resigned, and that's a diverse board. I mean, we've got Christians of all types, we've got agnostics, we've got atheists, we've got some Jewish scholars. I don't think we've got any Muslim scholars there at the moment, but it's a pretty diverse board. And, you know, we pretty much disagree on everything. Like, you know, what can we know about Jesus, the method for studying Jesus? You know, what did Jesus mean by the kingdom of God? Who did Jesus think he was? The dating of things. But probably the one thing everyone on that board agrees on was that Jesus did exist, and those who deny that he exists are kind of like a repetitive sort of problem that just keeps coming up, and it won't seem to go away. And I think Larry Hurtado at the time said this Jesus mythicism seems to sort of, you know, like an ancient deity. It seems to rise to life, then dies, then half a century it comes back to life again. So it's like a, you know, an ancient fertility god, if you like. And we thought about dedicating a whole issue of the journal to refuting Jesus mythicism, and then we decided no, because it's probably not worth it. Okay, because it's, you know, it's very fringy, and I'm very glad the journal continues to do well under James Crossley and Anthony LeDunn. Now, I've got to be honest. I do tend to be a little bit dismissive of the Jesus mythicism crowd, because the interactions I've had with a few of them online and in other places have not really endeared them to me. I'll be perfectly honest. The impression I've got is that some of them are very angry. In fact, even their smiles need anger management therapy. And I do have a stereotypical image in my mind of some angry guy in his early 30s living in his mum's basement, you know, with Richard Dawkins themed bed sheets. Now I know that's a caricature, but, you know, from what I've seen of the people who are pushing these theories, it doesn't seem to be that far off. I mean, because it's so dogmatic. That's what I find frustrating about it. The Jesus mythicist crowd, that Jesus did not exist, seems to be a real big dogma. It's something that they seem to stake their atheism on. I remember Bart Ehrman, who's certainly no friend to historic Christianity. He got stripped of an award by a humanist society in North America for believing that Jesus existed. The whole Jesus mythicism was also very, very important to the propaganda of the Soviet Union. Numerous Soviet publications, you know, pushed this idea that Jesus didn't exist, particularly as something apparently disproved by the release of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So I have to say, I've never really given a lot of time to the Jesus mythicist program and its main contributors. And if you go online, you know, you can find out who they are at the moment. But I mean, let's think for a moment. Let's be fair. If Jesus did not exist, what would that mean for the church, for Western religion, Western civilization? What would be the ramifications? And before that, I guess we should think, well, maybe they're onto something. I mean, you know, to be honest, you know, Jesus wrote no book. There's no ascription by him or of him or explicitly about him, as far as we know. There are debates as to whether any of his disciples actually wrote any book. Did Peter really write First Peter? Did, you know, John, the son of Zebedee, really write the gospel in his name? Did Matthew really write the Gospel of Matthew? And we know that ancient peoples believed in all sorts of gods and deities and portents and signs and, you know, cutting open chickens to tell the future and mythology. And some would say our sources are late, mostly in the early 2nd century when it comes to the New Testament. Maybe they're biased. Maybe they're written by people who were dislocated by time, geography, and culture far away from the original events. And in fact, probably the most sympathetic reading of the Jesus mythicism crowd comes from a recent article by Justin Meggitt, a Cambridge scholar writing in the journal New Testament Studies. He says, it is elitist, okay? It's unfair to be completely dismissive of the Jesus mythicism theory, okay? Because unless you've worked out a precise historiography that requires the historical Jesus, I mean, they're well within their rights to launch a type of objection. Otherwise, down the road from me, there's a scholar at ACU, the Australian Catholic University, called David Litwa, a very capable scholar. He argues the Gospels are not history that became myth. Rather, the Gospels more like myth that are given a sort of air of history by the evangelists. I mean, that does sound conducive to a kind of Jesus mythicist theory. Be that as it may, I'm not a Jesus mythicist. I'm not convinced that Jesus did not exist. I don't think it's all that credible. And as much as I would love to be sympathetic to the Jesus mythicist crowd, I just can't go along with it for a number of reasons. Let me give you, I think, roughly 9 reasons why I don't find the Jesus mythicist view to be compelling. Reason number 1, okay? The Apostle Paul is our earliest source for Christianity, and he knew some of Jesus's brothers and some of Jesus's earliest disciples. He talks about the brothers of the Lord in 1 Corinthians. If you go to Galatians 2, he met James, Peter, and John. Okay. This Paul himself, who probably did not see the historical Jesus, although Stan Porter wrote a book arguing that there's a good chance that he did. Personally, I don't think Paul met the historical Jesus, but he certainly knew people who knew him. Okay, that seems to be clear from something like Galatians 2. Okay, now I could understand people thinking there was hundreds of years between a Jesus and the development of a myth, but we're talking within 10, 15, 20 years at the most, where Paul is hanging around and breaking bread with relatives and close associates of Jesus. Number 2, okay, Paul refers to Jesus's human life, teachings, crucifixion, and resurrection. From Paul, we could say he knows that Jesus was born the normal human way, born of woman, born under law, that he's a Jew, he's associated with the line of David. He's sort of a kind of a new Adam as well. He had brothers, one called James. He had a meal on the night he was betrayed. He was crucified, died on a cross. It was believed he rose from the dead and was seen by Peter, James, the disciples, and 500 people. And in his name, the church has spread. So Paul doesn't mention a lot of Jesus's teachings or life because that's not what he's doing in his letters. He's responding to a whole bunch of pastoral crises, whether it's the arrival of intruders into Galatia, talking about circumcision, or the super apostles in Corinth, or dealing with issues about the collection, or how do you keep your head down and stay away from the stay under the radar of the Roman security apparatus. He's dealing with that kind of stuff, okay? All the things about who is Jesus probably came up in evangelism or discipleship. But that leads to my 3rd point. Paul does quote Jesus at certain points. You see this in particular in 1 Corinthians 7, where he's dealing with the issue of things like marriage and divorce. And what's very important there, Paul is able to differentiate something that Jesus has spoken about, and then his own judgment on the matter. Now, some people speculate that prophets would speak in the first person for Jesus. Like a prophet would prophesy in Jesus' name and say, I, Jesus, command you. And some people speculate that those prophetic utterances eventually got attributed to the historical Jesus, and they were kind of retrojected back into his life. And yet Paul shows a very keen sensitivity to not confusing his own words with what Jesus actually said, and the stuff that Jesus actually did address compared to the stuff that he didn't address. Okay, so I think that's a good evidence that Paul was in contact with the Jesus tradition about Jesus. 4, we've got the Gospels themselves are based on earlier traditions. Yes, we know the 4 Gospels are not independent of each other. You've got Johannine tradition, which I think is maybe semi-independent of Mark, but then you've got Mark, and wherever Mark's Gospel come from. Was Mark just making stuff up around 70 AD, or is he kind of writing up a maybe Pauline theology in light of Petrine memories? I mean, that's something, I've argued. But underneath the Gospel of Mark, you've got a whole bunch of sources, traditions, I think oral, written. Is there a Q source around there somewhere as well? Depends who you ask. Mark Goodacre, Paul Foster, you'll get different answers on that one. And it's easy to say, look, obviously the evangelists have influenced the tradition that they've received, okay? And the sources themselves have been influenced. So they're largely writing up the story of their own faith and belief that merely has Jesus as the subject. So some argue that the Gospels are not actually about Jesus, they're about what gospel communities believed about Jesus. Okay, now that's a little bit true. I mean, they're telling the story of Jesus from their own perspective, from their own vantage point, but I still think that the Gospels are actually meant to be about Jesus, and that they seem to be aware of what is their post-Easter perspective on a pre-Easter time. I think that comes out in Luke every now and again. He seems to be aware that he's writing from a post-Easter perspective about pre-Easter events and scenes and interactions and things that have taken place. But here's the other thing you have to remember, okay? It's one thing to say that the evangelists have influenced the telling of the story, but who influenced the influences? I mean, this is a point that Dale Allison makes. He says, look, you can say the evangelists themselves have influenced the shape of the story, but who influenced them? And this is where I think we have to talk about the logic of history, that the historical Jesus made powerful impressions on people, on his initial followers, wider circle of followers, supplicants of healing, certainly on wider networks of people, admirers, or people who knew of him and about it. He had a powerful impact upon them, and his message really did resonate with them and cause them to kind of make this effectively a new religion, or sorry, not a new religion, that would be wrong, to make it a new focus within Judaism on Jesus as the key messianic agent, the one in whom the end of ages was coming. Okay, so I think the Gospels are based on earlier tradition. We can debate how reliable that is, how much authenticity and artistry is in there, but I still think there's definitely some authenticity in there as well. Number 5, we have the testimony of Josephus, the famous testimony Flavianum. Now, obviously, the current form, the received form of Josephus's testimony to Christ in book 18, verses 63 to 64 of the Antiquities, has clearly been dressed up a bit. I mean, the language as we have received it has been dressed up by a Christian copyist or a Christian scribe. Nonetheless, a lot of scholars still think there was an authentic Jesus passage in Josephus's works, and you can find some, I think, Arabic or maybe Syriac versions of what Josephus says, and they lack up the real glossy testimony to Jesus. And another thing I think is interesting, and I learned this from Stephen Carlson. He says maybe the best influence for a Jesus passage in Josephus is the fact that people like Pliny, Suetonius, and Tacitus refer to refer to Jesus, or at least to the movement of Christians that take his name. And when they're talking about Jesus, I don't think it's independent. I think they are dependent, most likely, on Josephus. Okay, so maybe Josephus influenced later historians, and the best evidence for the Testimonium Flavianum would be from some of those early Greco-Roman historians in the late 1st and early 2nd century. Number 6, I think I have to say that new religious movements, NRMs, require a charismatic leader, and Christianity would not take the shape that it did. It would not become what it was without a dynamic, charismatic figure like Jesus. And let me revisit here David Litwa and his suggestion that the Gospels are myths made to look like history. I mean, that will sound very conducive to the Jesus mythicist viewpoint, and maybe meet with gasps of excitement, anticipation by the online mythicist community. But Litwa himself is not a Jesus mythicist. He believes in a historical Jesus. And Litwa says in his own words that the existence of Jesus is the most plausible hypothesis to explain the Gospels as literary products. So even Litwa thinks that Jesus is the best reason to explain why the Gospels were written, why they took on the shape that they did, although we can maybe have a few debates and discussions about myth history and that kind of a thing. Number 7, and this is the big weakness of the Jesus mythicist viewpoint, the alternatives. This is where they really fall down. Okay, look, it's one thing to question the historical authenticity of Mark, to talk about how Paul never met the historical Jesus, to talk about Luke maybe being written on, in the 2nd century or something like that. But what is the alternative view to explain why Christianity began, why it took the shape that it did, and why do we have these books called Gospels? And this is where they've got to come out with some, rather peculiar theories, like they simply took ancient mythology and they recast it amongst a historical Jew that was invented as a kind of pious fiction, or it was a conspiracy theory, or they talk about these secret gospels which give the real story as to what happened in the early church. And I'm sure you could probably find some UFO theories in there and something to do with pyramids and all that kind of thing as well. The real weakness of the Jesus mythicism is their own view that it involves everything from astrology to conspiracy theories, explaining how they think Christianity began and took the shape that it did. Number 8, I think we can find a good parallel with mythicism and Muhammad. Muhammad, the chief prophet of Islam. Back in the 1990s, it was very popular to allege that even Muhammad did not exist. He himself was a mythical figure. Now, the reason you can do that is, after you've got the Arab conquests of the Arabian Peninsula, or the Muslims dominating the Arabian Peninsula, and then they start spreading. It really takes 200 years for the Islamic movement to crystallize, take on a more sort of definitive shape, and to become more recognizably the sort of the Islamic religion that we know it to be. And it's alleged in that 200 years there was a lot of development, a whole mythology created about this figure called Muhammad. However, I think that view has definitely lost favor. I think most people would say, most historians of Islam would say, no, there definitely was a historical Muhammad, and that the revisionist theories are making too much of too little. But it's an interesting analogy, isn't it? The sort of Jesus mythicism and the Muhammad mythicism. And you've got to wonder, is this more of an aesthetic thing going on, being able to eliminate religions by eliminating the founder of these religions? 9th, and finally, that's the testimony of ex-Christian scholars. Here I think of Maurice Casey and Bart Ehrman. They've both written their own books against Jesus mythicism, to the effect that Jesus definitely existed. And they've really made parts of the atheist and the Jesus mythicism community really, really unhappy. I think Bart Ehrman is probably considered the equivalent of the Benedict Arnold of North American atheism because of his belief that he won't give up that Jesus existed. Bart Ehrman's certainly no friend of historical Orthodox or evangelical Christianity, but he's willing to say what he thinks it's true, and Jesus definitely existed. So even the most popular, learned, unbelieving scholars who have a Christology so low it could win a limbo contest against a leprechaun, even they admit that Jesus existed. So what can we say about this then? Well, like I said, I'm trying to give the Jesus mythicist a sympathetic reading. I'm trying to, find some things I can affirm. And yeah, look, we can have critical readings of our sources, have a certain kind of hermeneutic of suspicion, but at the end of the day, I think a historical Jesus is the best postulate to explain why the early church began, had the characteristic emphasis that it did, and why our sources, Paul's letters and the Gospels, why they look the way that they do. I can finish off with a quote from Simon Gathercole, who said, "These abundant historical references leave us with little reasonable doubt that Jesus lived and died. The more interesting question, which goes beyond history and objective fact, is whether Jesus died and lived." But that is probably a podcast and vodcast for another day. So there we are. Jesus mythicism is going to get a big no deal from me. Next time, I'm going to have a brief look at Jesus and archaeology. What light does archaeology shed on the historical Jesus? Now, I'll give you a hint. I don't think archaeology proves anything about the historical Jesus, but there's a lot of stuff there that is very useful for understanding the historical Jesus, particularly in his Greco-Roman context. So there we are. That's the end of the first show. Hey, please share with your friends, give us a rating, leave a comment. Otherwise, if you want to keep in contact with me, then you can follow me on @mbird12 on Twitter. Check out my YouTube channel, Advancing the Christian Tradition, or sign up to my Substack page. You can get the free emails, or you can sign up especially and get to the newsletters for members. So thanks a lot for listening to the first episode of Nazareth to Nicaea.